What we know is when a child ages out of care, their likelihood of negative consequences, long-term negative consequences, increases significantly. Homelessness, unemployment, early parenting, substance abuse, all of, not because they're bad kids. Again, we don't want to play into the misperceptions that too old, too dangerous, they've been in the foster care system. Rather, they don't have the safety net of a family. They're not allowed to make a mistake. They're not allowed to stumble. They get caught into systems immediately rather than having arms wrapped around them and guide them along the way.
Aging out of foster care is the greatest source of the flood. Unfortunately, few seem to realize this. Whatever the scenario may be, once a child is separated from its parents, justifiably or not, they are introduced to a long series of strangers. From a social worker, to a foster home, to a lawyer, maybe a different social worker, to a judge, to a new foster home, then perhaps another, to finally an adoption. At which point the child's birth mother might struggle back and forth with the child's new parents for custody, or perhaps partial custody. The child may return to the parent or parents from which they were taken. Maybe they were taken unjustifiably. In some cases, the parents actually were abusive to the point where the government was right to have intervened in the first place. Or maybe there was a change of heart and the child is abandoned. And then the process happens all over again. It must be hard for a young person who is continuously passed around in this chain of strangers not to think nobody wants you. And if there is one weak link in this chain, the opportunities the child has also weaken immensely. And the longer the chain, the lower the chances of success. In some circumstances, there is an individual which oversees this entire process. That person is called a CASA, a court-appointed special advocate. All of these individuals the child encounters have several cases to manage. The CASA usually has one child to look after and acts as the connective tissue through this long series of events. And if there is one weak link somewhere in the chain, they often have the tools to fix it.
Experience of growing up, it's very hard to imagine a child who has nobody. And in this system where children are separated from their families and when circumstances don't allow them to return to their family, these kids really are alone. And, they're vulnerable to all kinds of predators and people who take advantage of them. But they also just don't have that sense of security or solidity of anybody supporting who you are as a person. And I think that CASAs often find themselves, particularly with older children, in the role of just being that for them.
If you ask most people, what's a homeless person? And I do ask that question quite a bit.
Really?
I'll hear the same things over and over again. Old white guy with a scruffy beard, wearing a dirty jacket, pushing a basket, he's drunk or he's mumbling to himself. That's a homeless person.
They give you a physical description.
Right.
Yeah.
And I show them a picture of, Angelica, who's up on my wall right now, who's this beautiful little girl. And I go, she was homeless too. Doesn't fit your description. She and her sisters didn't have a home, and they stayed in our shelter.
A number of years ago, we began to focus on the subset of those children, the children most at risk of aging out of foster care. So they've been in care for years, they've been freed for adoption, and then they turn 18, and that's the point at which they're released from the system, and the systems had failed them and hadn't found an adoptive family for those children. And that's about 20,000 children each year. So year over year over year, those children age out of foster care. The Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption stepped in and said, there's got to be a better way to serve these children. It is the birthright of a child to have a family, right? It's the legal and moral obligation of the systems that surround them to find them a family. And miserable failures 20,000 times year over year on the system's part that we didn't find them a family. So we created this model that we decided as a national nonprofit grant-making organization, we could dedicate our resources to this target population of children.
If you end up out of foster care at 18 and aged out, which means nobody ever wanted you, you didn't get connected to any family and anything, you have to look up the numbers, but I believe it's something like 60% end up homeless in the first year, like 2/3 end up in jail, 10% manage to graduate high school, 2/3 end up on drugs. They have their kids taken away at enormous rates. That's another policy. They make up these policies. These foster kids, let's have money for the ones who are doing well. We want to reward. So if they're in this college, we'll give scholarships. That money goes unclaimed because you find 2 people in all of Los Angeles because it's not meeting them where they're at. Where they're at is so terrible, the outcome for these kids.
Different psychiatrists that are involved in this sort of stuff, and they both came up with different studies and whatnot, but it was somewhere in between 40 and 60, so we'll just say 50% of children that age out end up homeless.
Yep.
Chronic homeless.
Yep, chronic.
Not homeless for 2 months, homeless for 5 years.
Right.
So if it's 20,000 a year, that means you're adding to a pool of homelessness in urban environments of 10,000 a year. 100,000 every decade.
Over a year. And the one study that we go back to all the time is that first year out of care, 1 in 5 children are homeless, and those are the ones we know about. That first year, they exit the system and they're homeless. Those are the ones we're not accounting for, the ones that have a friend and they're couch surfing and they go somewhere else on their couch. They just don't have someplace to live. Absolutely, we have got to stop the madness. Here's what we know: by the time a child turns 9 in care and they've been freed for adoption, their likelihood of being adopted decreases significantly. So children age 9 and older, children in sibling groups, children with special needs, children who've been in and out of care for so long that they've given up hope on themselves, they've given up, and they push back when efforts at permanency are applied to them. So we focused on that. We created a model that said there's got to be a better way. We looked around the country and asked, why is it that children are aging out of care in your community? What is it that you're not doing, or what is it that you're doing but's not effective in getting these children adopted? And at the time, the default method of getting these children adopted was public displays. Put their faces on a website and hope that charismatically someone who's looking at how to adopt sees this website and sees these children and says, there, that's my child. A catalog of children. And sometimes it works, but for this target population of children, again, older youth, children in sibling groups, children with special needs, typically a family that jumps into this arena of I'd like to adopt a child doesn't look at a website and see a sibling group of 3 ages 8, 12, and 15, one of whom has been in and out of the juvenile detention center perhaps, and say, there's my ideal family, right? Because we carry these myths and misperceptions about who these children are. They're too old, too damaged, too dangerous, when they're simply reacting to the systems that have failed them and surrounded them for years. So we created this model that said, you can't just put their picture on a website and hope that they will get adopted. That's not effective. And is that how you would want your child in a system? If your child had to go in the system, is this how you would treat your child? And so we created what we call a child-focused model, a child-focused recruitment model. And what it says is just do good social work. And what we would do is give grants to organizations, large or small, public or private, to hire a full-time adoption professional who would carry a small caseload of the longest waiting children in their community and do a number of things. First and foremost is create a relationship with that child. If a child's been in care 5, 6, or 7 years, they remember former foster parents. They have a range of adults and families that surround them already, best friends, coaches, teachers, therapists. They have a number of adults in their circle already that they relate to, that they understand, that they care about, and who care about them. And so by developing this relationship with the child, the full-time adoption professional we call a recruiter, not only begins to gain the trust of the child, but begins to learn this sort of forensic journey of where this child has been and who has surrounded them, and they become potential adoptive resources. And then the recruiter also does a deep dive into the case file, so the agency has kept a case file logging everything that's happened to this child along the way, every court hearing, every placement, every movement to and from their home, who's in this child's life. And then they do what we call a diligent search. They may use technology tools or just through the digging through the case file and begins to reach out to extended family members, best friends, families, whatever it is, and begins to identify real potential adoptive resources for this child, someone who already cares about this child. And then the recruiter goes and begins to make those connections, prepares the child for what is this adoption journey going to look like, prepares the family for what has this child experienced. Here are some challenges they may have experienced along the way. In other words, setting the real stage for what does it look like to bring this new family together. And then the recruiter stays with the family until it gets to a court hearing and the judge says this is a legal family. And frequently, quite honestly, the recruiters stick with the family post-adoption so that they help, because they have developed a relationship with the family, so that they can help with any challenges that may come along the way or any needs for resources. So it is really just good social work, but it wasn't good social work that was happening in the system for this target population of children and youth.
What's the workload of like a social worker, for instance? How many children do they have to oversee?
Somewhere between 30 and 50 children is what you hear in Los Angeles. I think that the best practice level, what's considered something manageable and where you can actually do a good job for everybody involved, is closer to 17 children.
17 is a good number, but 30 to 50 is what Los Angeles is.
And I mean, in Los Angeles, the numbers have been very beyond that basic best practice number for a long time. And the size of the foster care population in Los Angeles is very large because the county itself is very large. So the challenges of just the scale of it are huge.
The child-focused model of adoption developed by the Dave Thomas Foundation, 300% more effective than any other in successful adoptions of youth at risk of aging out, involving a light caseload for the social worker, as of 2020 has been brought to scale in 11 states throughout the country, as well as various regions in Canada. Once it is brought to scale in all states, and particularly those cities experiencing the highest rates of homelessness, it will prove to be the greatest preventative measure to the crisis out of any other program. However, for inclusion of those currently experiencing homelessness in the U.S. cities, the greatest challenge lies somewhere else.